Alright, so a lot of people have been interested about Turf War from what I've seen. So I decided that I would make a bit of a comprehensive list and give some commentary about my thoughts on each weapon and how I would place them. I've taken as much consideration as possible from recent results and usage rates for each weapon in order to describe them as accurately as I can. With that out of the way, some things you should know about Turf War is that the mode values weapons that have better than average painting, good combat capabilities, and great special specifically for the mode, such as baller and bomb rushes. Due to the mode demanding so many good qualities from a weapon, there will be a lot of outclassed or unqualified weapons in the list. So, don't, only to not make that as a surprise. With that out of the way, let's get the elephant out of the room first, which is going to be VL3 and L3D. These are the two most played weapons in the turf meta and have exceptional qualities for the mode. They have good kits, stats, specials, and synergy. You haven't probably seen that many times of these being used on the western side, but Japanese side uses these consistently and very frequently. So they're definitely one of the strongest weapons in the entire mode. These two weapons should be treated as the golden standard for the mode's weapons, of course. And every kind of other weapon that you would want to compare should be compared to these two if you would really value a good weapon. Next up, good trooper, trash. Also, E-Leader is too slow, so you shouldn't consider that. V-Charger is not good because it doesn't have a good enough kit for the mode. The other bamboo kit is not actually good because it lacks any kind of good synergy into it. And Mark 1 has been kind of used before because it has a little bit more potential because the missiles are somewhat effective in order to get some enemies from a further away place. But you would have to kind of consider if you wanted to use it or not, because the weapon doesn't exactly paint well and isn't fit for every kind of map. And with the recent ink management nerf, I may say that it might belong into this kind of spot right now, but because of the change into it, it's still here, but we would have to see like how much it's going to get used for the mode. As for Firefin, it's definitely a great weapon. The kit's potential is incredibly good for the most. It's one of the only viable chargers due to having a suction rust to its kit. You'd think armor would hinder the weapon a lot more, but as the weapon doesn't have as big of an or like not the mode, but the mode or like not the weapon itself, but the mode itself has a bit doesn't have that big of an emphasis on armor. It doesn't get occasionally used, so the weapon is not going to be hindered as much. So you're going to have a lot more freedom of using Firefin and compared to on other ranked modes where armor is very frequently used. As for the K-Charger, it's outclassed by Firefin. It's not actually fit for the mode. While Baller is good for the mode, the weapon specifically lacks the type of strength compared to Firefin, as the Suction Rush is going to offer a lot more potential than the K-Charger itself. And as for Classic Squiffer, is sadly bad. And as for Neo Squiffer, if this wasn't like a competitive setting with like quads being made, like Squiffer would be here as a very good weapon for this particular mode. But as it's a quad and on an organized setting, it's not able to be used that well. But it has the potential that you could try and use it if you see any value in that. Ink Brush and the other few brushes are not usable, but Ink Nouveau has a really good kit since it offers survivability with Baller and has the mobility to stall and move around, and it offers a very unique approach to the mode. It has seen quite a good amount of usage and can be considered, but you may want to have some experience with how to build it into a comp as well as how to play the weapon itself, since it's a lot more specialized weapon compared to some shooters like L3D. Carbons have trash paint. You shouldn't consider using those at all. Now, V-Dynamo is bad, But the other Dynamo kits are in a very weird spot, since they have had some usage rates in here and there, which would make them have some potential since they offer like those decent kits. But due to them having issues painting effectively and long periods, they're not really good for the most part, since they can't really. They have the syndrome of like the other rollers, of having to roll in order to paint well, and because they use a lot of ink and on a much more like bigger area, they're not as good for that kind of purpose. You'd want to use some other kind of weapon that can do more accurate painting overall than a roller. But these two could be considered if you want to try them out, but you'd want to be more experienced with the weapon for how you want to build it for the mode, or like something like Humpback, or maybe some other kind of map where there's a good use from how the dynamo works. Yeah, so you can like lobber it around kind of slopes and other terrain. And every single other roller is also invalidated because of how they're rollers. They don't have good painting. As for the rest of the blasters, they are not good. They are not good because there's like only K-Rapid as the only kind of like viable weapon, or like has a potential in order to be viable. Like if you want to be setting it for like decent kinds of comps where you have some weapons with good painting supporting it, you'd still want to consider if you really wanted to have it in, because it's not a weapon that can paint a lot, so you'd want to have a lot of support with that weapon. But definitely something that would work if you have the kind of idea to make it work. You could say like if you wanted to try it on, then maybe it's somewhere here, but really I don't see the reason why you would want to use this at the moment, other than against armor or specific comps. But it's definitely fine if you want to try it out. And there's the rest of the blasters. And Arrow MG is not good because it doesn't have the combat capability, as well as there being another weapon that completely outclasses it. And Arrow RG is surprisingly one particular niche weapon, and that works extremely well on a very specific map, which is Snapper Turf. And it was recently used in one of the Koshians, where it got a very high amount of usage, even being used twice in some of the comps or like matches, and it was actually good and surprisingly got very nice results. So you should definitely consider if you wanted to use it on that map, but most of the other maps you would not want to use this. It's like the only reason why this is over here, and it's pretty much something you should regularly not use. It's only in one particular niche. And for the pros, bad painting. And also, here's like a thing that is kind of weird, that Junior works specifically for the mode because it has a good amount of painting and has seen quite a decent amount of usage. But it has the problem with its own accuracy, which you would really want to consider hard if you wanted to use it at all, since it can hinder its combat capabilities and how it's going to approach situations. So you'd want to have some specific weapons in order to support it a lot better, or like that have better combat capability, or really want that shift damage out of the bombs and such. But definitely consider if you want to use this at all. As for the other two kits, I see Custom Junior has like no viability. Auto Bomb is not as good as like the other bombs, and K Junior, well, it's kind of similar, and like V Junior, and it has a good kit. It's harder to justify using it as it's very special oriented compared to the other one. Since a Splat Bomb is going to be much more consistent for pressuring enemies, and you're not able to consistently pressure with Torpedo, as that's one of its main issues. The other Foil Squeezer is trash. While the Foil Squeezer is kind of in this rough spot where it has a really good kit going for it that could be extremely well in combat, but as the main weapon struggles at painting, it's not really used that much. As well, there are being other kinds of weapons that can earn pressure much more consistently from mid-range, so often it's just skipped completely. Gals aren't good, mainly because of how they paint overall. It's more of a sustained painting, which works better on a longer periods of time, but not in the type of like fast painting. So overall, they're not great. Beached is in a surprising spot where it's pretty much a niche on particular maps that are much more larger, so you can kind of get a larger range on them, as well as paint with missiles and try to pressure from a larger range. But overall, it's something that you want to consider if you want to compare it to like Bamboo in terms of its capabilities. And Custom Jet is kind of fine, but it's a very map specific weapon you do not usually want to consider, as well as it being barely hindered in some cases where you're not able to get your picks or pressure enough with the ray. The ray is the only reason you want to even consider Custom Jet, simply because it's not particularly good at painting if you can't really get anyone out with ray. Blizzard is trash, and T-Tech is unfortunately outclassed specifically by L3D because it has a much more consistent accuracy, painting capability, and everything else is just way better with L3D than T-Tech. You could maybe work it out, but I don't personally see any reason to use T-Tech over L3D, simply due to how the kits are way more fitting for the L3D than T-Tech. As for K-Shot, it has a particular niche because its missiles are still good, and it has a kit that paints pretty well, since missiles paint a lot more often than, and they really should be, because you can kind of spam with the weapon and do decently well. Although it doesn't have that good of a usage rate, you could consider using it. And also, V-Splash has the same issue of T-Tech. It's not... the sub just makes it invalidated by L3D. Neo-Splash is one of the best turfers, period, for turf. It's easily fit for any kind of niche comps where you'd have something like K-Rapid or any kind of other niche like Dynamo. You'd basically have Splash Neo being the hyper turfer of the team and just painting a really crap ton. And being a very good weapon for combat, as well as just being overly flexible. Well, you could fit into any kind of other comp as well, even with like stacking L3Ds and maybe something else that you may want to consider. As for 85, it's one of the most flexible armor weapons. It's basically the weapon that is much more consistently used than Junior, simply due to it being less flexible in combat, having a decent sub as well, and due to the fact that it's better in combat than Junior, it basically makes its usage rate better overall. As for 89, the potential of the kit is unfortunately lost in the sub, as you could say that it gets outclassed by K-Shot specifically, and this is the first case where you'd want to use K-Shot over Zap by any means. And it's not something you'd want to consider. V-Sploosh and Neo-Sploosh have no range to actually use, so you'd not even want to consider using them at all. H3 has a bad sub, so don't use that. H3D is the other of the few armor weapons that are decent, that are used like a decent amount, and it's the other counterpart to Zap in terms of flexibility, where H3 has a little bit longer range, has some slightly like different kill potential, but you take away some of the mobility that are from the Zap, and you just be a little bit more limited. So you would want to consider that if you wanted to use H3D or Zap in terms of if you wanted armor or like kill potential or such. But definitely you should consider using Zap if you wanted to have a little bit easier time with the weapon. KL3 is the only L3 that's not viable. The kit is what really hurts it a lot. Blobber in the current state of the game is not really good for turf. The mode works in a way that it gets hindered in combat and enemies can simply just avoid fighting against you, and turfing is more done in like linear places, so it's not really considerable. Now Try is in a spot where you shouldn't really consider it under most maps, and the only situation where you could consider using Try is on maps where it works well for sloshers, such as maps like Hopback or Macomart, where abusing the Terran for the slosher itself works extremely well. So that's one of the benefits of the weapon, but you shouldn't be using it in most other maps, simply due to how they lack in most of the combat and other capabilities. Now, but like, machines themselves have trash painting, and the Neo and K Machine had some usages on them, as well as like K Machine having a lot higher usage rate at one point, but it was from one particular player, and they have had prior experience and are much more consistent at them. Pretty much I wouldn't consider using none of these, simply due to how Bomb Rush has better options overall. So, like example for like Neo Splash, as well as like Firefin. So you don't want to use Neo for any reason. K Machine you could maybe work out if you wanted to use it, but still you'd want to consider if you wanted to have a bad painting capability with your weapon for a mode that heavily emphasizes that kind of function. Slosher Deco, as well as Soda Slosher, are in a spot where they have the same philosophy of being used in maps where sloshers get a good benefit out of the Terran. Both have good kits for the type of options you want to go for, with either survivability with Baller or more painting through Burst Rush. Same goes for like sloshers and Try, that you not want to use it in any kind of map where they don't get a good benefit out of them. You could maybe try out like Soda or Deco if you really wanted to, but personally I don't see any reason. And V-Slosher is really hard to place, because I want to place it around the barely good and trash, or like kind of outclassed. It's not terrible by any means, but it's harder to justify using V-Slosher over the other two options, because they offer only slightly better options compared to it. Because you could, if you wanted to go for painting, you'd go for Soda. If you wanted to have survivability, you'd go for Deco. It's not bad by any means, just you'd want to consider if it's really much justifiable compared to the other two options. V-Explo is completely outclassed by Custom Exploser, as Custom Exploser is incredibly good for having like chip damage and being fit for various different maps, and being able to paint far away due to its lob shots. Baller just gives it the survivability it needs, and bubbles are much more harder to justify than it, simply due to how much survivability it gets, as well as stalling and repositioning. It's very much a popular weapon, so you'd want to consider using it for some kinds of maps and comps you'd want to use. The regular ballpoint kit is bad, but Ballpoint the Bow has great flexibility for the mode in terms of its usability. It serves really well, and as well you can just shift into the long range mode, which is not as much hindered due to the mode, how it functions. It is likely going to be the only beacon weapon and that you see being viable, as most of the other beacon weapons don't have the same flexibility as Ballpoint, so it's got that going for it. Beacons don't have that big of an importance, but they can work out really well if you want to keep up momentum on some cases, or if you want to trick some people. Hydra has bad pain, don't use it. Now, for the Sync Mini and K Mini, they are specifically not good enough compared to Mini in terms of its usage. But here's what you should be considering is that while it does have the good kind of painting as well as a nice kit, because it also offers the same kind of missile usage, but it can be hindered by certain weapons that are far more used, because it can have some issues approaching enemies. So it's not terrible by any means, but you want to consider if you wanted to use this. But it's not bad. Nod has bad painting, and heavy and the deco variants do not have that good enough painting or kits. They're not really well suited, and if you wanted to use Ray, you'd specifically use Custom Jet even as a niche, and that's one of the reasons why V Heavy can't really compare to Custom Jet, because it has better flexibility for moving around and painting a little bit. So there's that. And to get something out of the way, there's also Remix, which has gotten used like a couple times, but personally I don't see the point in using Remix because it doesn't have that good of a painting. It feels very underwhelming, and Booyah Bomb in itself is very replaceable, so you not even want to consider using this unless you really wanted to. If you would find some kind of usage with specific maps where using Booyah is effective. The BDS and CDS are very hard to say on how they would be placed, because the kit itself can work really well for both of these, and they can work well in combat, but how their painting works for this particular mode is kind of hard to justify using, simply due to how both of the weapons have a lack of ink management issues, so they're not able to paint for long periods of time, as well as being in combat and then going out of it, they need to recharge. So you'd want to think if you wanted to use either of these. They're not bad by any means, but they're very much not often considered due to there being other options. With also like just ink management issues is a very big flaw to them. Gluggas have bad paint and ink management issues. Don't use them. Now, for the Splat dualies, I would say that a V dualies could have some potential usage because it has a good kit going for it. But because of how the nerfs, as well as how their hitbox and range works, they're not really considerable enough, simply due to how they can be inconsistent at combat and not being the most exceptional weapons for painting purposes. Most likely you would want to consider like K-Shot if you wanted to use a shooter weapon of similar qualities like V dualies. For Dapples, don't use Dapples. Like, why would you even use these? They don't have the same kind of like range to work for the mode, so just please skip them. Don't ever think about using them. Tetris unfortunately have bad painting for them. Undercover umbrellas are, if they had a more consistent combat capability, Surela Undercover could be potential as a niche, like right about here, but currently it stands in a point where you'd not want to consider using it at all. So they currently stand at the trash range. For Surela Undercover Umbrella, no, not Surela Undercover, but like Surela Umbrella itself invalidates the regular umbrella in terms of its usability. It offers a really good kit, really good burst painting, and has a incredibly synergistic kit, and works extremely well for pressuring and painting for in bursts. So you'd want to consider using it quite a lot. Although if you're playing like in Western side, you'd probably not want to use it since lag can be an issue. But if you want to try it out, then yeah, go for it. It's a really good weapon for the mode because of its synergistic qualities as well as being able to paint well. Now, tents are in a kind of spot where Cerelatent is very easily placeable on the list because of how it has a good painting on it. But the other two units are really hard to place because they have varied usage rates as well as results. But the other two kits, like Camo and V10, offer a particular niche. In the other one offering utility, and the other one offering like aggression and skill potential. But both of these qualities in a weapon aren't as required. The only instance is that you have a consistent combat capability, but not a effective combat capability, which is why some weapons like range blaster and such have good combat capability, but they have bad painting. Like both Camo and VTED have kind of an okay-ish combat capability. Like Camo has a much more stronger combat capability compared to Cerelatent. But if you would want to sacrifice going for something like a stamp, you'd not usually want to consider using these two. And pretty much V10 could have some potential, since it's like the only other beacon weapon that could have potential, just like BPN. But it's still on a spot where you'd really want to consider if you would even want to use it in the first place. As for Splatoon 7, it doesn't have the range to stay consistent with. As for Mark 3, it's outclassed by the Mark 1 kit. Red Squiffer is outclassed by L3D because of the kit. As for Permabrush, it's a very surprising placement how I'd want to place this, because it has gone a very nice amount of usage rate, and really good usage rate from the recent Koshin. It paints well and offers armor, which is harder to come by, because there aren't really that many armor weapons that are viable at the moment. There's only like 4 weapons if you count them right now. As for its like usage rate, you'd want to consider if you want to use it, because it's more for specialized players. So you'd really want to play around with it a ton before considering it, because it's much more easy to use like something like Zap, since it's a lot more flexible. But definitely can get results, so keep that in mind if you want to play the mode. Grim range is a very weird spot, because like back about several months ago, it was used quite a lot in like comps where there weapons like Newsplash with Hyperturfers, where you'd have it doing like chip damage and such, and being like the aggressive part of each comp. But from recent usage rates, it has not been used by any means. It seems that it has been completely outclassed by some options, or players just completely stopped using it. So it would be safe to assume that it's just not good in the current state of the game, especially when there's such things like armor that can be occasionally used for turf. But you could try out if Grim could work for you. But keep in mind that it's gonna have a hard time against certain armor weapons if it gets timed correctly against it. PG has somewhat potential because of its kit and painting capabilities, and Burst helping out with its combat capability. But the thing about it is that it still has that combat issues, as well as being the Boya Bomb being a replaceable part about it. Like Boya Bomb is not the best at painting, so you'd have like issues really like using it compared to anything else that's going to be much better at painting in Burst, like still Suction Rush, for example. So it's something you could consider for specific maps like Humpback again, but not a good weapon by any means. Now 83 is something that I honestly do not know how big of its potential is. But from recent times, there hasn't been as many like usages from 83, if at all really. So if it's quite safe to say that it doesn't see any kind of like potential overall by other players. And Storm can be replaceable as well, the same way as Boya Bomb, since it doesn't really offer too big of a painting capability compared to just throwing bombs and such. And last but not least, there's the cherry, and it's a straight up no. Don't use it. And to recap the current list of weapons that are currently viable, you would notice that most of the good weapons have great flexibility on them, and they're going to be much more consistent at what they're going to do. And some maps are going to have certain options as being viable. Well, like try is being viable on specific maps, and as well as like Aero RG. But more often you'd want to have weapons on these two parts, and maybe consider some of the other parts. You can even stack some comps with going like double L3, then fitting like one of the other flexible options, then just going with it. And that's what has been for the past few cautions with its usage rates. There are also the other ones that I mentioned earlier, such like dynamos maybe having potential, as well as the other weapons being like kind of usable. But you'd want to consider if you wanted to use all the much more established weapons that have a lot better flexibility for each kinds of comps. So yeah, there you have it.